As we've already heard this morning, the First World War marked for many the first modern industrial war. And indeed, as we've heard, total war. With it came new technology and destruction on a massive scale. Mines killed hundreds in single explosions. Gas seemingly melted lungs and eyes. And machine guns signaled inevitable slaughter for those ordered to charge. I want to turn our attention for the next hour or so to the psychological and neurological effects of the First World War, particularly in the year 1916. Medical personnel were already well aware of injuries commonly referred to as, quote, shell shock. Yet 1916 marked a turning point in which nations and militaries were forced to confront the destruction the war was causing on human minds. I'd like to begin by exploring how medical personnel came to understand shell shock and how they attempted to mitigate the war's damage. Then I'd like to turn our attention to the ways in which shell shock came to have greater meaning beyond the medical history of the war. Physician Charles S. Myers first wrote in print the term shell shock in this February 13, 1915 article in the British journal Lancet. He argued that the impact of an exploding shell could impair the senses: hearing, sight, smell, and taste. The symptoms doctors soon placed under the term varied. There were cases ranging from staring eyes and nightmares to violent tremors and paralysis. In fact, the term became so broad that some argued it included any malady other than a physical wound. Not long after Myers' first article, many doctors did come to understand the distinction between what we would call physical brain injury and psychological mind wounds. But cases were often difficult to distinguish, and I'd like to provide you one here. This is Frederick Mott's work. This is a published book. And this case is a case of what he calls functional facial paralysis. The patient was asked to do the following: in A, normal expression; B, to close both eyes; C, to hold a smile; and D, to frown. You can see that one side of his face is completely operational, the other side is not. Here's the story on this individual. December 26, the platoon was mending barbed wire, and they were in an old German dugout when a shell burst and filled the dugout, all but completely covering him except for the left side of his face, by which he was unable to breathe. He was unconscious for 3 days. He knew nothing of what had happened himself, and the above information is the result of what he was told by a comrade who had not been buried but had his arm blown off. After 8 months, he had been seen by a great number of doctors, and his face had not changed. He had been x-rayed without results. He remembers going into the dugout, and he hears in his mind the shell coming. He has terrifying dreams of his experience at the front. According to the doctors that assess this soldier, there's nothing physically wrong with the muscles in his face, and yet he has been in a shell explosion. He has suffered concussion, and yet he has also experienced the trauma of war. So I want to just emphasize here that sometimes diagnoses blurred the lines between physical damage and mental damage, and we can see in this case how that happens. I want to emphasize here that my contention is that wartime trauma is intimately connected with culture and local politics, and each nation experienced trauma during the First World War and dealt with shell shock differently. In today's presentation, I am admittedly blurring those lines for purposes of emphasizing the year 1916. Early in the war, many failed to recognize the existence of war injuries of the mind. Dr. Charles Wilson, who served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, wrote after the war, "In those early days, we did not bother about men's minds. We did what we could for their bodies. We did not ask whether a man was wearing well or if he would last. Of course he would last. Why shouldn't he? The British military, for example, court-martialed and executed those individuals whom they viewed as cowards rather than injured men. On a number of occasions, military officers and doctors' accusations of malingering led soldiers to commit suicide. At best, a shell-shocked soldier might be sent home to an asylum. Military officials couched their descriptions of shell shock in language suggesting the soldiers' lack of courage. They described soldiers cracking up and losing their nerve. These were signs of emasculating fear, and as one soldier explained, "I mustn't show them I was afraid." By 1916, large numbers of shell-shock soldiers had become too significant to be ignored. As American Thomas Salmon observed in his reports from France, no medico-military problem of the war are more striking than those growing out of the extraordinary incidents of shell shock. These disorders accounted for 1/7 of all discharges from the British Army at that time. As attention grew, so too did debates regarding terminology and meaning. Shell shock, perhaps, was the best diagnosis that one could get. It signaled, at least in title, a physical cause, and thus it gave the soldier who was diagnosed with it a sense of legitimacy. War neuroses, hysteria, and other like terms signaled a psychogenic, or what we would consider a psychological cause. Psychological causes were sometimes seen as legitimate, originating in the unconscious mind of a soldier who remained willing to fight, but unable to control the flight behavioral instinct embedded deep within the psyche. Other times, it was considered illegitimate altogether. Perhaps the soldier was intentionally malingering. Perhaps the soldier was simply exhibiting feminine weakness. Often, which diagnosis a soldier received and the meaning of that diagnosis depended on time, circumstance, commanding officer, and doctor. Treatments for shell shock and the associated disorders, war neuroses, male hysteria, took a variety of forms. Sometimes punishment, sometimes, as shown here, hydrotherapy. Others included hypnosis, what we would describe as physical therapy, talk therapy, and relaxation, what S. Mitchell called the rest cure, mixed with a sense of obligation and reminders of cultural expectations of what masculine men should be and do. Often, these techniques were referred to under the broad umbrella of re-education, validating the soldier's condition and convincing him of his ability to get well. Remember, these are attempts to get at the psychological causes that underlie shell shock. The most controversial of treatments was electrical fluoridization, practiced widely in Austro-Hungarian units and to a lesser degree among British, French, and others. It relied on electrotherapy as a method not only to identify active methods, but to use pain to convince soldier of his ability to use his paralyzed limb. Debates regarding causes and methods of treatment continued throughout the war. No less than 223 American journal articles appeared in the war years regarding this topic. German, French, British, and other publications number even higher. 1916 proved especially crucial for American doctors who would come to Europe, observe treatments, and develop their own eclectic approach to treatment when the US entered the war in 1917. They would develop the most comprehensive plan for such disorders. Discourse regarding shell shock for Americans shifted towards recognizing shell shock, under its various names, as a legitimate war wound and providing treatment in frontline hospitals just as they would for the physically wounded. You can see this is a flow chart of hospitals for Americans diagnosed with shell shock. At the very top, you'll see field hospitals, then followed by base hospitals. We have overseas. What I think is most important and significant about this document is you'll see the arrows on the right-hand side here going all the way up to back to the field hospitals and to the front lines. There is this notion that comprehensive American treatment looking at shell shock as a legitimate psychogenic war wound will enable American physicians to heal soldiers and them to the front. So the United States military, directly because of 1916 and this period of observation that they have, take a dramatic shift in treatment. They provide a proactive medical approach, at least in policy, that legitimizes the soldier's wounds, provides specialized care, and emphasizes cure. Despite improvements, however, shell shock remained a medical military problem throughout the war, and it would have significant consequences in terms of permanently wounded in the aftermath. Statistics are difficult to identify. By one count, for example, British cases numbered 800,000, but based on differing diagnostic criteria and potential late onset of symptoms, statistics are difficult to estimate. What is clear is that the cultural significance of shell shock extended well beyond the war years and well beyond the numbers of actual soldiers affected. Historians have long contended that the shell shock took on cultural significance in Europe, becoming a symbol for the devastation of war itself and Europeans' inability to recover from it. This national trauma was expressed in public news in the years following the war, and I want to give you two examples of this. One is that the Commission for Inquiry into Violations of Military Duty in the Austrian Parliament investigated the role of military psychiatrists who had, the trial revealed, applied painful electrical shocks to soldiers' nipples and genitals. Physicians without any neurological or psychiatric background were put in charge of departments in field hospitals in which nervous illnesses were treated. In this case, we get a sense of what punishment could mean at its very worst. Isolation cells, cold showers, straitjackets, electrical shocks, naked exposure, and public humiliation. Similar debates arose in Great Britain and continued into the post-war era. The British War Committee also held an inquiry into shell shock, and this was really central in British news. Such discussions did not end with the immediate end of the war. This memorial in Great Britain, entitled Shot at Dawn, was completed in 2001 and honors the legacy of shell shock as a symbol of war. Again, I want to emphasize the importance of 1916 to all of this discussion. The Shot at Dawn Memorial notes specifically the 346 soldiers that were executed for malingering or cowardice along those lines, and we see that the greatest number of soldiers were executed in 1916. This begs the question for me, what would have, as a historian, this is really bad to do, but what would have happened if the war would have ended in 1916? We see this sort of escalation period that really happens in 1916 with the treatment of shell shock soldiers. The national trauma also became visible in literature and art. This is a picture of Craiglockhart Hospital, which opened in 1916. It would famously house Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon enlisted early, was noted by many as a distinguished fighter. He was present at the Somme, and it was shortly after, in 1917, that he became disillusioned with war. Sassoon's poem, Survivor, not only describes the tremors and nightmares, but also the feelings of hopelessness that accompanied what Sassoon and others saw as a failed victory. A glorious war that shattered all their pride Men who went out to battle, grim and glad. Children with eyes that hate you, broken and mad. Wilfred Owen enlisted in 1915 and posted on the Western Front, January 1917. He also attended Craig Lockhart Hospital after he was diagnosed with neurasthenia. Dulce Decorum Est is one of his works. Gas, gas, quick boys, and ecstasy a-fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling in the floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the mist, pains and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitter as the cut of vial, incurable sores on innocent tongues. It continues. This idea of the trauma and magnitude that soldiers are experiencing because of the war becomes very real in this literature. Otto Dix enlisted in fall of 1915. He also participated in the Somme, eventually earned the Iron Cross in November 1917, was transferred to the Eastern Front, and then back to Flanders in 1918. He has a series entitled Der Krieg. This is one of, I think, the most impressionable of his pieces. We see here those signs of shell shock in those large eyes, the face, the expressions of the hands and the fingers, writhing both, I think, here in physical pain and in the mental anguish of war. Eric Remarque, as was mentioned earlier this morning, the author of All Quiet on the Western Front, was transferred to the Western Front in 1917. I'm showing a picture of the film, the American film that was made afterwards in 1913. In it, a young recruit loses control of his emotions amidst an enemy shelling bombardment and runs out of the bunker screaming. His temporary insanity results in a physical injury, and he later dies of those wounds. Obviously, this is not a full accounting, and yet this is a glimpse into some of the individuals whose work has become part of the memory of war. They had experienced horrors, and horrors from which they believed they would never recover. As we sit here at the centennial of 1916, I wonder what would have their works looked like, or would they have produced such works had the war and devastation ended in 1916. Sassoon, Owen, many of them are visiting Craig Lockhart Hospital in 1917 after years of fighting. Years of experiencing these kinds of trauma. It was the persistence of war that deepened both the numbers of shell-shocked soldiers and narratives regarding shell-shocked nations. Indeed, it was not just soldiers, but nations and landscapes that all seemed irrevocably shell-shocked by war. The inability of the soldier, and indeed the nation, to recover from war was, as one historian has pointed out, regarded in much of the literature as a mental state which mirrored a social disease and national degeneration. Intellectuals and early psychologists had long discussed industrialism's ability to overload the senses and cause what American George Miller Beard termed neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, war neurosis, shell shock. They signaled the dangers of racial degeneracy, and the breakdown of the highest stratum of modern Western civilization. Carolyn E. Plain's well-received 1925 study of France and Germany, Neuroses of the Nations, drew the conclusion of degeneracy most sharply. She reiterated the theories of many of her peers that society was literally a more or less organized mental system, and that beginning in roughly 1889, individual men inundated by nerve stimulation had begun losing their ability to reason. The tension found in European civilizations due to advancement and industrialization, Plain argued, had caused these men to initiate what she labeled an insane war. There was no doubt, she said, that the pace of life had affected men's minds in a disastrous way, judging by their temper. This was especially apparent wherever men were collected in clusters, in concourses, in parties, in self-conscious national groups. For these groups, these collectives were so excited that their emotions were out of hand, uncontrolled, and uncontrollable. They became possessed of manias and ruled by anxiety, fear. The term social and national insanity, often used by writers of the war period, is no figure of speech. It is justified by the neurasthenical derangements exhibited by various group minds. These derangements are exhibited in the literature, in the art of the time, in political action, in the mentality and behavior of leaders and nations, in the teaching of inspirers of groups. Plain argued that a saner world could have avoided the war. Instead, Europe had lost its progressive movement and became irritable and overstrained, and too neurasthenical to think logically about the consequences of war. Public debates through war inquiries, popular culture, and intellectual discussions all contributed to a discourse revealing war's irrevocable damage to bodies and to nations. It is worth noting, as I did earlier, that the United States stood distinct, both in treatment and as well in national understandings. The United States, at least for some, and for a short period of time, believed they had done it right. They had used progressive psychological practices to heal soldiers, and with the help of Woodrow Wilson, avoided the neuroses of war in 1914. If we were to compare some of the literature and art that I've showed you about Europe from art and literature at the time in the United States, in the period of 1918, 1919, we would see a very stark difference. Oftentimes in American literature, the shell-shocked individual in the story is the heroine. All it takes is a crack over the head with a frying pan or holding their infant child for the first time. Those soldiers are instantly cured, and they turn out to be the great heroes of the story. So it's a very optimistic tone when compared to some of the works that we've discussed. The United States had this progressive mindset. They appeared optimistic and in control of both American medicine and of politics. The central question of the post-war world would become, who could repair the irreparable damage that had been wrought by years of war? Who could restore Europe from its shell-shocked state? Today, as we gather here for the 1916 centennial event at the museum and memorial, I challenge us to remember the legacy of war in its medical and cultural effects. Shell shock has become an important part of the museum. The horrors of war are pictured in the individual experiences of soldiers and in descriptions of wartime medicine. Let us also remember the extensive debates regarding the definition of shell shock and how it would be treated. Let us remember how the initial assumption that strong men would survive war without blemish proved false. For us, never forget, the common saying we often link to World War I, should also remind us of our past attempts to treat war's mental trauma and of the great, I would argue, inevitable mental toll war takes on individuals and nations. Thank you.
Thank you for that great talk. I assume you're familiar with Pat Barker's trilogy about the war, and as you know, Sassoon and Owen are characters in there, the first and second novel. Two-part question. One, obviously it's a novel, it's not supposed to be accurate, that's not the point of writing fiction, but of course it's based on real events, and the psychiatrist who treats them and so forth. So I wonder if you want to reflect on her treatment. And also, both of them obviously go back to the front after they're treated there. And I wonder how common that was among, whatever belligerent you want to talk about. British, obviously, but perhaps other belligerents as well.
Regeneration has done so well, and I think so many people have read it. I think it's a wonderful work of literature. I think that Sassoon and Owen's experience was quite unique when compared to other individuals. William Rivers was at Craiglockhart for a particular moment in time when it did have a very sympathetic and understanding approach to shell shock. And I think we see that in Rivers' relationship with Sassoon. Sassoon is an officer. He's a decorated officer at the time he goes there. So I think the story does a good job of capturing that, but not necessarily of what it might have been like to have shell shock if you were someone other than Siegfried Sassoon. So I hope that sort of answers that part of the question. For them to both go back to the front, I find Sassoon is a very interesting case because, in fact, it's sort of clear that he doesn't really have shell shock, but that he suddenly, in early 1917, just becomes so upset by the length of the war and what he begins to perceive as political bodies that are pressing this war onwards when individuals are just dying. And I think he had a real sort of moral conscience in terms of the men under his leadership. And I think what happens at Craiglockhart is he is essentially convinced to go back and that the patriotism is worth fighting for. What exactly that experience was like for him, I can't really speak to a lot of detail, but I can say that a lot of his writings occurred well after the war. I was looking that even late in life, he was writing about the horrors of war and the shell shock and returning and just being dissatisfied with the social network he was returning into. So I think that gives us a glimpse into the fact that I don't think his mentality about war changes. I think he still holds on to that throughout his life.
Just the last part of the question, are there statistics about how many people returned to the front after being diagnosed with shell shock?
After treatment. There are not a lot of statistics about those who return. Great Britain, for the majority of the war, has their treatment facilities in England. They don't do the frontline clinics. So most people, I would argue, that sort of have this is a bad way to say it, a more distinctive shell shock, like the pictures that I showed, do not return. They stay in France. Now, or in Great Britain. In the American case, I think many were sent back. I think that they did a lot of single-day treatments in the field right behind lines, and they sent them back out. The goal was to send very few back to the United States, and I think they accomplished that fairly well.
Thank you.
I'm curious if you have any information about what people felt like at home, both during the war and after the war, about soldiers that were affected by shell shock, whether they were treated properly or not. And kind of the background of my question is I think of Patton's famous incidents of abusing soldiers.
Slapping a soldier.
Right.
Yeah,
and, and the fact that also that I believe in the RAF during the Second World War, there was the lack of moral fiber category. And so it seems like the lesson didn't stick, at least in some quarters.
Yeah, that's a, the at home and what people thought, I think, really varied depending on the nation. Great Britain, obviously, there isn't, especially at the beginning of the war, there's not a lot of sympathy for these guys. You're not physically wounded, why can't you fight? That's your duty to our nation, is to fight, you need to be over there. And I think that's really pervasive. I think that public understanding and concern for the way soldiers were treated increases with public dissatisfaction with the war, and it sort of reaches its climax in the post-war period, and I think there's a correlation there with how they perceive the individual soldiers. In the United States, it's a little bit different because they really are honored as heroes. If someone is shell-shocked, it's kind of cool. It's like almost like better than a physical wound because it shows true bravery, that you've put yourself in some kind of a condition in which there's been all kinds of shells exploding and trauma, and that you've pushed through and done this for your country. So there's a kind of honor there that's associated with it in the U.S. context that doesn't exist so much in Europe. The World War II and Patton, that's a really fascinating story. And in my work, I argue that what happens, it's very specific to the U.S. context. And shell shock is used in the U.S. context. It's a diagnosis. It is a term. It is a valid war injury. You can be diagnosed with shell shock. You are taken to a hospital. You are treated by a certain series of steps. And it is the most comprehensive system that the U.S. military will use for psychological treatments until well into the Vietnam War. And the reason I think there's this moment in World War II is because the U.S. military invested so heavily in World War I treatments. They had the best doctors in the United States on the Western Front. These are guys from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, that are treating soldiers. And there has been money poured into these field hospitals, and they're doing everything they can. And yet after the war, there is still this very large, and indeed the population grows, of individuals who return, who claim to be shell-shocked and become permanently disabled. So I think for the U.S. military, there's almost this feeling that, well, we tried treatment and it didn't work. Therefore, shell shock must be caused by something else. If we try treatment and our treatment doesn't work, it must be because it's hereditary and it's within the soldier and something that no medical technology could fix or heal. So by the time we get to World War II, they do not include psychologists or psychiatrists in the military units as they had in World War I, and instead they invest very heavily in screening. So the idea is we've already screened out all those people who would suffer from shell shock. So if you suffer in the field, it must be because you're just being a pansy, right? And you need a good slap because shell shock is hereditary and we got rid, those people aren't here. So it's a much less sympathetic approach than it is during World War I.
Your next question will come from this side.
Hi. Is there any distinction in the literature, the medical literature or whatever, between the idea of what you might call an acute or a single incident versus cumulative? I mean, because you see these going up by a time that these guys have been in the Western Front for a year, 2 years, which is very different than somebody involved in one attack. And not to say that might not be terribly traumatic, but that, and did that result in any management in terms of rotating men, rotating units to try to reduce kind of the cumulative stress?
I think there definitely, doctors definitely tried to find that association. What is the magic combination of events and pressures that cause someone to sort of to snap, as they might say? Is it that they've been without food for 2 weeks and they're malnourished and they're tired because they haven't slept and they've been under bombardment and then this traumatic thing happens? In the literature, they're very careful to document everything that has happened to that soldier before the onset of symptoms, and I think that's why. I think that doctors are at a loss as to what that combination is. Certainly time on the Western Front makes, I would argue, tremendous difference in how they're treated. Yeah, and you asked a second part to your question that I've forgotten.
Just did they evolve any sort of rotation of units? For instance,
Right.
at Verdun, the
Yeah,
French rotated,
yeah.
the Germans didn't.
So there is in the American force, which I'm most familiar with, there are psychologists, a psychologist or psychiatrist placed with each unit, and they're responsible for pulling men out when they begin to see signs. So they'll pull those men out, they'll take them back to a field hospital or maybe further back somewhere quiet, let them rest for a few weeks, and then send them back to the front. So there does become sort of a preventative strategy, if you will, for trying to recognize that early and not letting the condition worsen.
I'm writing an article about a soldier, a Vietnam War veteran, who discovered he had PTSD sometime after the war, and he went to the Veterans Hospital in Topeka, and they told him to write his trauma. And that sounds a little bit like what happened with Siegfried Sassoon and the other gentleman. I'm wondering if that was something that they prescribed, or if that was just something that Mr. Sassoon did on his own. And is there some sort of, it doesn't sound like, I don't think that happened after war, I don't think that happened after World War I before modern diagnoses of PTSD. First off, yeah, did Siegfried Sassoon do that on his own? Or was that something that doctors talked about, prescribed? And even in America, did they prescribe writing your trauma?
I think for Siegfried Sassoon, it was both. I think that for that writing trauma was definitely used during the First World War. It's really interesting to me the variety of techniques that World War I, at least American physicians, really tried. They had soldiers painting, they had soldiers doing sort of occupational therapy, doing things with their hands, crafts. They put them in farms to help them try to heal. They're doing talk therapy. So there is a lot of attempts to remember the event fully in order to be able to process it, if that makes sense.
It sounds like then the modern PTSD treatments are in some ways a trip back to the future.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that, so once I talked about this period in World War II where they're just like, we don't need treatment, let's just get rid of it. All that's brought back during the Vietnam War, and they actually refer back to Thomas Salmon and his writings, and he's the one who designed the treatments and the processes for World War I. So there's a direct correlation there between what happens during Vietnam and what happened in World War I.
Thank you for this very dramatic presentation, because it's very interesting to see how people with their unsophisticated knowledge of neurology grappled with this subject. I've always been curious to know, with our sophistication of neurology, whether some scientist has done the definitive clinical 3D explanation for exactly what happened to these individuals that suffered from shell shock. That's the first part of the question. I'd love to know why it happened to some and not others. My grandfather was buried by shells and also gas, but didn't suffer from it, and he was a quiet farmer from Pennsylvania. And I'd also like to know whether the Germans sustained as many cases as did the English, the French, and the Americans. Was one country, did one country present with more cases of shell shock? So in other words, ultimately, why did it happen to some and not to others? I'd like to know if there's a modern explanation for this.
So I'll answer the second part first about German cases. Paul Lerner has done an excellent study on German cases of shell shock, and in part what he argues is that interpretations of cure become very different based on the national context in which the soldier is placed. So after the First World War, there are many shell shock cases in Germany, what they refer to as male hysteria. They are deemed cured when they can again work. So the definition of cure is your ability to be a sufficient worker and participate in the state. So many of those soldiers never return to their families. They develop sort of group homes, barracks for them to live in, and those soldiers are deemed cured because of their ability to work. So yeah, what constitutes cure, how many are diagnosed, definitely has that national component, but there are definitely large numbers of German cases. As far as the clinical definitions of shell shock and a definitive study, there are definitely some cases that have tried to look at shell shock in a lot of detail and really play out what individual cases and what happened to them. Anthony Babington is one that looked at the British case. I always caution about studies that use presentist ideas and medical terms placed onto another time period, because the whole concept of what shell shock was is so culturally embedded, it's hard to make those comparisons. Although certainly people do, and historians have done great work doing that. Yeah, so there are some individuals that argue, well, if we look back at Achilles, there are signs of shell shock, right? And then we look at Civil War, and we look at World War I, and there is certainly to what I believe, there's trauma running through every war. The way in which the body exhibits trauma, I think, is very culturally based. If we were to look at films of soldiers under shell shock treatment, the stills I took of Netley Hospital are from a film, and those soldiers exhibit trauma very differently than soldiers today with PTSD. So it's an interesting comparison there of trying to figure out what actually was going on.
And our last question will come from this gentleman.
It sounds like you're quite familiar with current PTSD, Gulf War and all, Iraq and all that. The soldiers there are, quote, volunteers, unquote. Has anybody ever looked at the difference between that and conscription, as in Vietnam and World War II and World War I and Civil War? I particularly emphasize Civil War. And we need to remember also that this post-traumatic stress disorder and shell shock are wastebasket terms, medically speaking. What about the looking at of brain chemicals in response to stress? And we certainly know that those things manifest themselves differently in different people. Has anybody looked at some of those issues? You sort of alluded to them. And
Yes, so thank you for that question. I think it's a good one to end on, bringing what happened in World War I to the present day. I think that it's really interesting to look at how definitions of shell shock sort of changed from this exploding shell to understanding that there's a real psychological component to going on. And I think even in present wars, we're still dealing with this distinction between post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and PTBI, post-traumatic brain injury, right? And how do those, when do they overlap? What is the brain doing? What does the brain do under stress? What does the brain do under the impact of an explosion? And I think that there has been a lot of work done on brain chemicals, as you suggested. And I think that work really is continuing now. I think I saw a recent article in the New York Times that talked about, doing MRIs of soldiers' brains and seeing how being in an explosion had affected the brain and might even affect behavior and emotions and stuff like that. So I think that the interesting thing for me, the volunteer versus conscription, I don't think that there's necessarily a difference in the number or type of individual affected. I think it is really based on time, circumstance, the number of traumas that soldier has experienced. It's just, you were at the wrong moment at the wrong time, and these symptoms develop. What's interesting is that I wonder if our sympathy for PTSD and PTBI will be as great as it was in Great Britain and Germany after the wars, because they are volunteers. And so that's something that I find really interesting to think about. Does volunteering, what does that do to our understandings of what a soldier should experience, or what the consequence of that volunteering is?
Please join me in thanking Dr. Anessa Stadler.
Thank you.